I used to believe a locked ranch gate meant something in Texas, but that was before an HOA president decided my property line was just a suggestion. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't birds or wind across the pasture. It was the metallic crack of my gate snapping open like a rifle shot echoing across 40 acres of dry hill country dirt. I was halfway through my coffee when the sound hit, sharp and wrong. Then came the low rumble of an SUV engine climbing the gravel path that didn't belong to anyone except me. By the time I stepped onto the porch, the dust cloud told me everything I needed to know. Brenda Whitmore had done it again. Her white Range Rover rolled calmly through the broken gate posts like she owned the place, tires crunching across the caliche road my father laid down 30 years ago with a borrowed tractor and a stubborn sense of pride. She didn't even slow down. She just waved once through the windshield like this was a friendly neighborhood shortcut instead of private land. That was the 7th time that month. 7 times my gate had been pushed open, bumped aside, or driven straight through by residents from the Willowbrook Estate subdivision sitting just beyond the Cedar Ridge. According to Brenda, that road across my ranch was now community access. According to the county deed locked in my filing cabinet, it was absolutely not. But Brenda Whitmore had never been much for reading documents when she could invent rules instead. The woman had that polished HOA smile you see in real estate ads. Perfect hair, bright sunglasses, and the confidence of someone who believes paperwork bends around her will. She was president of the Willowbrook HOA, a development that had sprouted up 5 years ago where cattle pasture used to stretch to the horizon. 120 beige houses, identical mailboxes, and a board of directors that thought grass height was a moral issue. When those homes went up, the developers promised residents easy access to scenic country routes. The problem was the scenic country route they had in mind happened to run straight across my land. At first, it was just the occasional lost driver turning around near the gate. Then it became delivery vans. Then golf carts. Then entire morning commuter traffic cutting through my property to shave 5 minutes off the highway. Each time I rebuilt the gate, they treated it like an inconvenience. Each time I posted a sign, it disappeared. And every time I confronted Brenda Whitmore about it, she gave me that same polite, dismissive laugh. "Daniel, you can't block community access," she told me last week while standing beside the broken hinge of my gate like it was my fault gravity existed. But what Brenda didn't know, what she never bothered asking, was that before I bought this ranch full-time, I spent 15 years designing structural security barriers for federal projects. Concrete barriers, reinforced gates, perimeter systems built to stop vehicles that were a lot bigger than a luxury SUV. So while Brenda kept driving through my ranch like the land belonged to her neighborhood, I was standing on my porch that morning watching dust roll across the pasture and realizing something simple. Some people solve problems with complaints. Engineers solve them with designs. And Brenda Whitmore had just given me the perfect blueprint. My name is Daniel Carter, and the 40 acres outside Burnett County that you heard about in the last part are not just land on a survey map. That ranch is the closest thing my family ever had to a legacy. The place still smells the same way it did when I was 10 years old, sun-baked cedar, dry limestone dust, and the faint metallic scent of old fence wire warming under the Texas sun. My father bought the property back in 1992 when this whole stretch of hill country was still quiet enough that you could hear coyotes across the valley at night. He was not a wealthy man. He ran a small welding shop in Marble Falls and saved money one slow paycheck at a time until he finally managed to buy those 40 acres from an aging cattle rancher who wanted to retire. I still remember the first weekend we came out here together. The gravel road that leads to the house did not exist yet. The gate was nothing more than 2 rough cedar posts and a chain with a rusted padlock. Dad stood there with his boots in the dust, looking across the open pasture like a man who had finally built something that belonged to him. Over the next few years, he turned that empty land into something real. He laid the caliche road that now runs from the highway to the barn. He dug the small stock pond on the lower side of the property where the ground collects rainwater every spring. And he built the ranch gate that now sits at the center of this entire mess. That gate was never fancy. 2 thick cedar beams, reinforced hinges, and a simple steel latch that made a satisfying click when it closed. But to my father it meant something important. It meant that the land behind it was ours and nobody else had any business coming through unless they were invited. When I left for college, I studied civil engineering because I had always liked the way things were built. Steel, concrete, load calculations, the quiet logic behind structures that stand for decades without anyone thinking about them. Eventually, that path led me to working on infrastructure and security barrier projects across the country. Bridges, highway supports, reinforced perimeter systems for federal facilities. Work that required precision and patience because when you build something that is supposed to hold a line, it has to hold every single time. Meanwhile, the ranch stayed in the family. My father ran a few cattle here until his knees finally gave out, and the work became too hard. When he passed away 5 years ago, the property came to me along with the small, weathered house sitting on the hill. I moved back full-time not long after that. Life out here is simple in a way cities rarely are. Morning coffee on the porch while the sun climbs over the cedar trees. The quiet hum of wind across the grass. Sometimes a pickup passing on the distant highway half a mile away. That was the rhythm of this place for decades. At least it was until the subdivision appeared beyond the ridge line 3 years ago. At first it started with survey stakes and bulldozers cutting across the neighboring pasture. Then came the construction trucks, the sound of nail guns echoing across the valley, and eventually rows of identical houses rising from ground that used to belong to grazing cattle. The development called itself Willowbrook Estates, which is a funny name when you consider there is no brook anywhere within 10 miles of the property. What it did have was a homeowners association with a long list of rules and a president who believed those rules extended well beyond the neighborhood entrance. That was the first time I heard the name Brenda Whitmore. According to the real estate signs, she was both the lead listing agent for half the homes in the development and the elected president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. In other words, she had every reason to make the neighborhood look convenient and accessible to buyers driving out from Austin looking for country living. The only problem was the fastest way to reach the highway from Willowbrook happened to run straight through my gate and across my ranch road. At first I assumed it was an honest mistake. New drivers taking a wrong turn, mapping applications that had not updated yet. But over time the pattern became harder to ignore. More vehicles, more dust trails across my pasture, and eventually one particular white Range Rover that seemed to appear at the gate far more often than coincidence could explain. The first time Brenda Whitmore drove through my property, she barely slowed down. The second time she gave a quick friendly wave like neighbors passing on a quiet road. The third time I realized this was not confusion at all. It was the beginning of a habit. The first real conversation I ever had with Brenda Whitmore happened on a bright Saturday morning about 2 months after Willowbrook Estates officially opened its front gate. I remember the day clearly because the air smelled like fresh-cut cedar and warm limestone dust, the kind of dry Texas heat that settles over the hills before noon. I was halfway down the ranch road repairing a section of fence when I heard the steady hum of a luxury engine climbing the gravel path toward my gate. A moment later, the white Range Rover appeared again, rolling slowly past the cedar posts like it had done it 100 times before. This time I stepped into the road and raised my hand before she reached the bend. The vehicle stopped about 20 feet away and the window lowered with the smooth mechanical sound you expect from something that costs more than most pickup trucks on the road. That was my first close look at Brenda Whitmore. She looked exactly like the kind of person who runs a homeowners association. Perfectly styled blonde hair that probably never sees a strong wind, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of bright smile people practice in real estate seminars. Her voice carried that polished friendliness that always feels just a little rehearsed. She introduced herself immediately, explaining that she lived in Willowbrook Estates and served as the president of the Homeowners Association. She said it the same way someone might casually mention they run a city council meeting. I told her my name and explained that the road she was using ran across private ranch property and was not open for neighborhood traffic. For a second her smile stayed exactly the same, frozen in place like a photograph. Then she gave a small laugh, the polite kind that suggests the other person is misunderstanding something obvious. According to Brenda, the road had been used by construction vehicles for months while the subdivision was being built and several residents had already started using it as a convenient connection to the highway. She called it a community access route, a phrase that sounded official even though it had never appeared in a single document related to my land. I told her that construction crews had been granted temporary permission by the previous landowner next door while they were finishing the subdivision entrance. But that arrangement ended when the development opened. The gate at the edge of my property existed for a reason. Brenda tilted her head slightly like she was considering the idea, but the smile never disappeared. She explained that homeowners in Willowbrook appreciated having a faster way to reach town, and that the route through my ranch saved several minutes compared to the main entrance road. The way she said it made it sound less like a request and more like a helpful explanation of why things would continue the way they already were. I told her clearly that the road was private and that I would be reinforcing the gate to prevent further traffic. That was the first moment her expression changed. Not anger exactly, just the subtle tightening around the corners of her mouth that appears when someone hears the word no and does not like it. She nodded slowly and said she understood my concern about privacy. Then she added that Willowbrook Estates was growing quickly and the Homeowners Association always looked for ways to improve access for the community. She thanked me for the conversation, raised the window, and drove forward again along the ranch road. Like the discussion had simply been a friendly suggestion instead of a boundary. As the dust settled behind her tires, I remember standing there beside the cedar fence line, feeling the first quiet hint that this situation was not going to resolve itself politely. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing small details that made the picture clearer. More cars started appearing on the road during the early morning commute. A delivery van passed through one afternoon carrying packages addressed to houses inside Willowbrook Estates. And one evening, I spotted a temporary wooden sign planted near the gate that read Future Community Access in bold black letters. I pulled it out of the ground before sunset and leaned it against the barn, but the message was already obvious. Brenda Whitmore was not treating my ranch road like a mistake. She was treating it like a plan. The next week was when the quiet routine of the ranch finally started to break. At first, the change was subtle enough that you could almost pretend it was coincidence. A silver pickup truck rolled through the gate early Monday morning while I was checking the water trough near the barn. The driver slowed down just long enough to give an awkward half wave before continuing down the gravel road toward the highway as if the route had always existed. Later that afternoon, a delivery van appeared, its tires kicking up pale dust that drifted across the pasture like a low cloud. The driver stopped at the gate when he saw me standing there and asked if the road connected to County Road 12. I told him it did not connect to anything except private land and that he would need to turn around. He apologized, backed up carefully, and left the way he came. That was the last polite encounter I had with someone using that road. Over the next few days, the traffic increased in a way that was impossible to ignore. 2 vehicles on Tuesday morning. 4 on Wednesday. By Friday, the road looked less like a ranch path and more like a shortcut used by commuters heading toward the highway. Every set of tires left new tracks pressed into the pale limestone dust. I could follow them clearly from the gate all the way to the edge of my property, where the road curved back toward the county line. Each evening, I walked that stretch with the quiet frustration that comes from watching someone slowly test the limits of your patience. The gate became the center of the problem. The cedar posts had held steady for decades, but they were not designed for daily traffic. One afternoon, I found the latch hanging crooked after someone had forced the gate open without bothering to stop. Another morning, the chain had been left lying in the grass like it was an obstacle someone had stepped over rather than a boundary meant to be respected. The pattern was clear. Drivers from Willowbrook Estates had decided the ranch road was simply the fastest way to reach town, and they were using it more confidently every day. Brenda Whitmore appeared more often than anyone else. Her white Range Rover became a familiar sight rolling down the gravel path just after sunrise. Sometimes she slowed enough to lift a hand in greeting. Other times she drove straight through without even acknowledging that I was standing nearby. The message was always the same. She believed the road was already hers. One afternoon, I drove down to the Willowbrook entrance to see the situation from the other side of the ridge. The development looked exactly like the brochures promised. Clean sidewalks, perfect rows of mailboxes, sprinklers ticking across lawns that were probably measured with a ruler every weekend. Near the entrance stood a polished wooden sign welcoming visitors to the community. Beneath it sat a smaller board displaying neighborhood announcements. That was where I saw the notice that explained everything. Printed in bold letters was a message from the Homeowners Association reminding residents about convenient alternate access routes to reduce congestion at the main entrance. The line beneath it mentioned the Scenic Country Road connecting the neighborhood to County Road 12. Scenic Country Road. I stood there for a moment reading that phrase again while the afternoon sun warmed the pavement under my boots. There was no mention of private property or permission from the landowner. The road across my ranch had simply been renamed in a way that made it sound like a public benefit instead of someone else's driveway. On the drive back, I could already feel the quiet shift happening in my mind. Up until that point, I had treated the situation like a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a conversation and a stronger gate latch. But standing there in front of that sign made something very clear. Brenda Whitmore was not dealing with a mistake. She was managing a strategy. The ranch road had become part of her selling point for the neighborhood, and she had no intention of giving it up just because the land actually belonged to someone else. When I reached my gate again, that evening the wind had picked up slightly, carrying the dry scent of cedar through the air. I leaned against one of the posts and watched the last light settle across the pasture. Somewhere beyond the ridge a car engine echoed faintly along the road leading out of Willowbrook Estates. That was when the thought finally settled into place. If Brenda Whitmore was determined to treat my gate like a suggestion, then the next solution would have to be something that no one could casually ignore. The next morning I woke before sunrise with the same thought repeating in the back of my mind, like a quiet warning bell. If the road had become part of Brenda Whitmore's plan, then the gate was no longer just a piece of wood and steel. It had become a test. The sky was still dark blue when I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee and listened to the soft hum of insects fading as the morning light crept over the hills. For a few minutes, everything felt the way it always had on this ranch. Wind moving slowly through cedar branches. A faint smell of dust and dry grass. Then, right on schedule, the sound of an engine climbed up the gravel road again. It was not Brenda this time. A gray sedan rolled through the gate without slowing, the driver staring straight ahead, as if pretending the property line did not exist. 20 minutes later, another car followed. Then a small delivery van. By 8 o'clock the road looked like a quiet commuter lane cutting straight across my land. I spent the entire morning fixing the gate again. I reset the cedar posts, tightened the hinges, and replaced the old chain with a heavier steel latch that required an actual stop to open properly. The work took most of the afternoon, and by the time I stepped back to look at it, the gate stood solid and straight again, the way my father built it years ago. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the message would finally be clear. A gate means stop. Private land means private land. But that hope lasted less than 24 hours. The following morning, the sound that woke me up was not an engine. It was the sharp crack of wood under pressure, followed by the slow squeal of metal hinges forced past their limit. I stepped onto the porch and saw the gate hanging open at an angle that told the whole story without a single word. The left post had shifted several inches out of alignment, and the latch had been bent sideways as if someone had pushed through without bothering to stop. Dust still floated in the air along the road, drifting slowly across the pasture where a vehicle had just passed. Later that afternoon, I found the answer waiting in my mailbox at the edge of the property. It was an envelope printed with the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association logo. Inside was a neatly typed letter informing me that residents had reported obstructions affecting neighborhood traffic flow, and that the association encouraged cooperation to maintain safe access routes for the community. I read the page twice just to make sure I had not misunderstood what it was suggesting. According to Brenda Whitmore, the gate on my own ranch was now considered an obstacle to neighborhood convenience. The wording was polite, but the message was unmistakable. The road was no longer being treated like someone else's property. It was being redefined as a shared pathway that the community expected to continue using. That evening, I walked the length of the ranch road again, while the sun dropped low over the hills. Tire tracks cut clearly through the limestone dust in both directions, dozens of them layered on top of each other like a quiet record of every car that had ignored the gate. When I reached the entrance, I stood beside the damaged post and rested my hand against the rough cedar surface. The wood felt warm from the day's heat, and I could almost picture my father setting that beam into the ground with a level and a shovel more than 30 years ago. He had built it to last a lifetime, but he had also built it in a time when people still understood what a boundary meant. I stayed there until the light faded and the pasture turned a deep shade of blue under the evening sky. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the lights of Willowbrook Estates began to glow one house at a time. That was when the final piece of the situation settled firmly into place in my mind. Conversations had not worked. Repairs had not worked. Even a clear boundary had not worked. Brenda Whitmore believed the ranch road belonged to her neighborhood now, and she had already started putting that belief into writing. As I walked back toward the house, I could feel the quiet engineer inside my head beginning to examine the problem in a different way. Every structure has a purpose. Some structures guide people. Others protect something behind them. And sometimes the only way to end a misunderstanding is to build something that removes all doubt about where the line actually stands. The idea did not arrive all at once. It started quietly the same way most engineering solutions begin, with a problem that refuses to solve itself. Over the next few days I stopped trying to repair the gate, and instead started watching the road more carefully. Early morning traffic passed through between 6:30 and 8. A few delivery vans appeared around midday. In the evening the road carried another wave of vehicles returning toward Willowbrook Estates before sunset. It was predictable, almost organized, like a schedule no one had bothered to write down. I set up a small camera on the barn roof where it could see the entire entrance to the ranch road. Nothing fancy, just a weatherproof unit connected to a recorder inside the house. Within 2 days the footage showed exactly what I already suspected. Residents from Willowbrook were using the road constantly, and several of them were the same vehicles repeating the route every morning. And right in the middle of those recordings was the familiar white Range Rover driven by Brenda Whitmore. Sometimes she slowed at the gate and pushed it open herself. Other times she simply nudged forward until the weakened latch gave way. Each clip told the same story in quiet detail. The gate was no longer being treated like a boundary. It had become an inconvenience that drivers pushed aside whenever it slowed them down. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with the camera footage playing on my laptop while a legal document folder rested beside it. Inside that folder was the property deed my father had filed when he purchased the ranch back in 1992. The document clearly defined every inch of the land, including the gravel road that crossed the pasture and connected to the county highway. There was no recorded easement, no shared access agreement, no public right-of-way. The road existed for one purpose only: to reach the house and the barn sitting behind the Cedar Ridge. That was when I drove into town to visit the Burnett County Records Office. The building smelled faintly of paper and air conditioning the way county offices always do in Texas heat. I asked the clerk to confirm the legal boundaries and easements attached to my parcel number. 10 minutes later, she slid the same information back across the counter that already sat in my folder at home. The road belonged entirely to the Carter Ranch property. There was no community access route, and there never had been. On the drive back, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the hills, and the road ahead shimmered with heat rising off the pavement. By the time I reached the ranch gate again, the situation felt different in my mind. Until that point, the conflict had been about people ignoring a sign or bending a rule. But the documents made something very clear. Brenda Whitmore was not negotiating a misunderstanding. She was quietly redefining someone else's property as part of her neighborhood plan. That realization changed the way I looked at the problem. A gate is meant to signal a boundary, but it still relies on people choosing to respect it. If someone decides to ignore that signal, the gate becomes nothing more than a suggestion. That night, I walked the entrance road again while the sky faded from orange to deep blue over the hill country. The camera on the barn roof blinked softly in the dark, and the wind carried the dry smell of cedar across the pasture. I stood beside the leaning gatepost and pictured the entire entrance as if it were a design problem waiting on a drafting table. Soil stability, foundation depth, vehicle resistance, materials that do not bend when someone decides to push through. In my engineering career, I had helped design barriers meant to stop trucks weighing several tons from crossing restricted areas. Compared to those systems, the entrance to my ranch was simple terrain. As I walked back toward the house that evening, the solution finally started to take shape piece by piece in my mind. If Brenda Whitmore believed the road through my land was open to the public, then the next structure I built would remove every possible doubt about that belief. Because there is one universal rule in construction that every engineer understands. When a boundary is built correctly, it does not ask permission to be respected. The following week, I stopped treating the situation like a neighbor dispute and started treating it like a structural problem that needed documentation. The first step was patience. Every morning, I reviewed the footage from the camera mounted on the barn roof and watched the quiet parade of vehicles crossing the entrance to my ranch road. Sedans, pickup trucks, a landscaping trailer one afternoon, And always, at least once every couple of days, the white Range Rover driven by Brenda Whitmore gliding through the gate like the place had been added to her neighborhood map months ago. What surprised me was not that people used the road. What surprised me was how confident they looked doing it. Nobody hesitated anymore. Drivers passed straight through the entrance without slowing, as if the cedar posts and chain were nothing more than decoration along a public road. The more I watched those recordings, the clearer the pattern became. Nearly every vehicle came from the same direction, the northern corner of Willowbrook Estates, where the subdivision road curved closest to my property line. One evening I drove that direction myself, just before sunset. The sky over the hill country was turning the deep orange color that shows up right before the light fades across the cedar ridges. I parked along the edge of the subdivision road and walked the last few hundred yards where the pavement ended near the property boundary. The land between Willowbrook and my ranch was separated by a thin line of brush and limestone outcroppings, nothing that would stop someone determined to push through. And that was exactly what had happened. Tire tracks cut clearly across the dry grass where vehicles had driven around the brush line and created a narrow path connecting the subdivision street to the ranch road entrance. It was not an official road. It was simply a gap that had grown wider with every car that used it. Standing there in the fading light, I could finally see the entire situation the way Brenda Whitmore must have seen it months earlier. The subdivision had one main entrance that fed into a busy county road. During morning traffic, that intersection backed up with commuters heading toward Austin. But the small gap through the brush provided something much more valuable for someone trying to sell convenience. A quiet back route that cut straight across my land and connected to the highway half a mile faster than the official entrance. It was not an accident. It was a shortcut waiting to be claimed. When I returned to the house that night, I opened the laptop again and studied the footage one more time while the wind pushed softly against the windows. I paused several clips where Brenda's vehicle passed through the gate and noted the timestamps carefully. Then I opened the county map files I had downloaded earlier that day from the records office. The satellite view showed the same narrow strip of land between Willowbrook Estates and the Carter Ranch boundary. There was no road recorded there, no easement, and no survey marker indicating shared access. In legal terms, the situation was simple. The subdivision residents had created their own connection across property that did not belong to them, and the homeowners association had chosen to treat it like an official route. The evidence was already sitting on my hard drive. Video recordings, survey maps, county records confirming the ownership line. I leaned back in the chair and listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen while the plan continued forming piece by piece in my mind. Most people would probably start with a lawyer at that point. File complaints, send letters, wait months for the argument to crawl through legal channels. But engineers tend to see problems differently. When a system fails, you do not just argue about it. You redesign the structure so the failure cannot happen again. I stepped outside for a moment before turning in for the night and looked down the ranch road stretching into the darkness beyond the gate. The cedar posts leaned slightly from the last time someone forced them open, and the chain hung loose against the latch. In the distance I could see faint house lights from Willowbrook Estates glowing beyond the ridge. Somewhere over there Brenda Whitmore was probably already planning her next community newsletter, celebrating the convenience of that scenic country shortcut. I rested my hand against the weathered wood of the gatepost and felt the rough grain under my fingers. For 30 years this entrance had marked the beginning of the Carter Ranch. The problem was not that the boundary existed. The problem was that the boundary was too easy to ignore. And the more I studied the land around that entrance, the more obvious the next step became. If a simple gate could be pushed aside, then the next structure would need to be something that no driver could casually mistake for a public road ever again. The next step in solving a problem is always the same, no matter what field you work in. You gather proof. Not assumptions. Not opinions. Proof that holds up when someone else tries to argue the facts. That is exactly what I started doing the following morning. Before sunrise, I walked out to the barn with a thermos of coffee and mounted a second camera facing the narrow brush gap where vehicles had been cutting through from Willowbrook Estates. The wind moved slowly through the cedar trees, and the ground still carried the cool, damp smell that lingers before the Texas sun begins heating the limestone soil. From the hill above the ranch road, I could see the entire path clearly. The camera on the barn captured the gate entrance while the new camera watched the unofficial track that drivers had carved across the brush line. By the time the sun rose over the ridge, I was already back inside the house watching the first vehicles appear on the screen. The morning traffic began just like the previous days. A pickup truck crossed the brush gap at 6:35 and rolled straight toward the ranch road without slowing. 5 minutes later, a compact sedan followed the exact same line through the grass, as if the path had been there for years. By 7:15, the white Range Rover appeared again. Brenda Whitmore drove across the same opening in the brush, past the damaged gate, and continued down the road toward the highway with complete confidence. The cameras captured every second of it. I let the system record for 3 full days without touching anything except to swap the storage drives each evening. When I finally sat down at the kitchen table to review the footage, the pattern was impossible to ignore. More than 40 vehicles had crossed my property during that short period. Most of them came from Willowbrook Estates, and nearly all of them used the exact same entry point through the brush line. I began organizing the clips carefully. Each file included a timestamp and license plate frame clear enough to identify the vehicle type. The recordings showed cars leaving the subdivision, crossing the brush gap, driving through the ranch gate, and exiting toward County Road 12. It was not random traffic. It was routine use of a road that legally did not exist for anyone except me. After organizing the recordings, I added another layer of information to the file. I printed the official county survey map showing the Carter Ranch boundary and highlighted the location of the brush gap where the vehicles entered the property. Then I attached the property deed confirming there was no access easement granted to the Willowbrook subdivision or its homeowners association. The documentation now showed the entire story from 3 different angles. Video evidence, survey maps, recorded property ownership. I leaned back in the chair and studied the stack of documents spread across the table while the quiet hum of the ceiling fan pushed warm air around the kitchen. This was the part of the situation Brenda Whitmore probably never expected to happen. From her perspective, the ranch road likely looked like an empty piece of land sitting next to a growing neighborhood. If no one pushed back strongly enough, then eventually the road would simply become part of the community routine. That strategy works surprisingly often when people assume a property owner will eventually give up or move away. But what she did not understand was that I had spent 15 years working on infrastructure projects where documentation is everything. Every structure is supported by drawings, surveys, and recorded evidence, because when something goes wrong, the paperwork is what protects the design. By the time the sun dropped low behind the cedar ridge that evening, the entire situation sat organized in front of me like a case file waiting for a final step. The ranch road was private property. The shortcut through the brush had been created without permission, and the homeowners association president herself had been recorded using that path repeatedly. I gathered the documents together and slid them into a large folder before walking outside again. The evening air carried the dry scent of grass and limestone as the last light faded over the pasture. Down at the entrance, the old gate still leaned slightly from where it had been forced open earlier in the week. I stood there for a long moment looking at the narrow opening in the brush beyond the ridge where headlights would appear again the next morning. The evidence was now complete. The only question left was what kind of structure would finally close that shortcut for good. The plan began to feel real the moment I stopped thinking about the ranch gate and started thinking about the land itself. Gates are temporary solutions. They depend on hinges, chains, and the hope that people choose to respect them. Land, on the other hand, is permanent. And when you build something into the land correctly, it becomes part of the landscape in a way that is very difficult to ignore. The next morning I drove into town again, this time heading toward a small equipment supply yard on the edge of Burnett County, where contractors usually pick up materials for ranch fencing and foundation work. The smell of diesel engines and fresh-cut lumber hung in the air as I walked through rows of stacked concrete blocks and steel reinforcement bars. The owner, a man named Mike Holloway who had been supplying construction crews around the county for nearly 20 years, looked up from his clipboard when I stepped into the office. Mike knew me from previous projects I had worked on around the area. We had both spent enough time in construction to recognize the quiet look of someone preparing to build something serious. When he asked what I needed, I told him I was planning to reinforce the entrance to a ranch road and wanted materials that would hold up for decades rather than seasons. He nodded slowly and walked me through the yard where pallets of concrete blocks sat stacked under a wide metal canopy. As we talked through the measurements, the shape of the project became clearer in my mind. The ranch entrance sat between two natural limestone ridges that narrowed the land into a corridor about 20 feet wide. If that corridor were reinforced correctly, it could become a permanent boundary instead of a suggestion drivers felt comfortable pushing aside. Mike listened carefully while I described the layout, and eventually leaned against a forklift with a thoughtful expression. Then he gave a small grin and said something that confirmed I was thinking in the right direction. If you want drivers to stop treating a place like a road, you build something that clearly is not a road anymore. By the time I left the supply yard that afternoon, the bed of my truck carried survey stakes, measuring string, and a stack of printed diagrams I had sketched with the help of Mike's experience. The sun hung high over the hill country as I drove back toward the ranch, and dust followed the truck tires along the gravel road leading to the gate. That evening I walked the entrance again with the measuring tools and marked the ground carefully. The corridor between the limestone ridges measured just under 20 feet across at the narrowest point. The soil below the surface was dense enough to support a deep foundation without heavy excavation equipment. I placed the first survey stake beside the old gatepost and stretched a line across the entrance toward the opposite ridge. Standing there with the string pulled tight between those markers, I could already picture the finished structure. Not a simple fence. Not another wooden gate waiting to be forced open. Something solid. Something built directly into the ground that made the boundary unmistakable from the moment a driver approached the property. The work continued quietly over the next 2 days. I measured the foundation depth, calculated the concrete volume, and marked the alignment where the structure would rise between the ridges. The cameras on the barn roof continued recording while I worked, and each evening the footage showed the same steady line of vehicles crossing the brush gap and driving through the ranch road entrance. Sometimes they slowed briefly when they saw the survey stakes marking the ground near the gate. But most of them kept moving as if the stakes were just another temporary obstacle that would disappear soon enough. One evening, just before sunset, the white Range Rover rolled through again. Brenda Whitmore slowed slightly when she noticed the markers in the ground, her sunglasses reflecting the orange glow of the evening light. She studied the line of stakes for a moment, then continued down the road with the same confident expression I had seen so many times before. From her perspective, those stakes probably looked like another small repair project that would not change the routine she had already established for the neighborhood. I stood beside the ridge and watched the dust trail fade behind her vehicle as it disappeared toward the highway. The wind moved softly across the pasture, and the smell of warm cedar drifted through the evening air. The survey line stretched across the entrance exactly where the new structure would rise. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I felt something close to certainty. Because when an engineer finishes marking a foundation, the next step is no longer a discussion. The next step is construction. Construction began before sunrise 2 days later. The hill country was still quiet when the first truck rolled up the gravel road carrying pallets of concrete block and steel reinforcement bars. The air had that cool early morning edge that disappears quickly once the Texas sun climbs above the cedar ridges. I stood beside the survey stakes I had planted earlier in the week and watched the headlights sweep across the pasture as the equipment pulled into position near the ranch entrance. Mike Holloway climbed out of the cab wearing the same calm expression contractors carry when they know the day will involve real work. He looked at the line of markers stretched between the limestone ridges and nodded once, as if confirming what the design already showed. The corridor was perfect for what we planned. Narrow enough to control traffic, but wide enough to allow proper foundation work without disturbing the surrounding terrain. We began by clearing the shallow topsoil between the ridges where the structure would sit. The sound of the skid steer bucket scraping across limestone echoed softly through the valley, while cedar branches rustled in the steady morning breeze. By the time the sun lifted above the ridge line, the entrance to the ranch looked very different from the simple gate that had stood there for decades. A trench ran across the entire corridor, measuring nearly 3 feet deep and extending from one ridge to the other. Steel reinforcement bars were laid carefully into the trench in a grid pattern designed to anchor the foundation directly into the compact limestone base beneath the soil. As we worked, vehicles from Willowbrook Estates continued appearing on the road just beyond the brush gap. The drivers slowed down when they saw the excavation cutting across the entrance. Some of them turned around quietly without saying a word. Others parked briefly at the edge of the path and watched the work with puzzled expressions before backing away toward the subdivision street. The cameras on the barn roof recorded everything. By mid-morning, the foundation forms were in place, and the first load of concrete arrived in the rotating drum of a mixer truck that climbed slowly up the gravel road toward the site. The driver positioned the chute over the trench, and the thick gray mixture began flowing steadily into the foundation channel. Concrete has a particular smell when it first pours into place, a sharp mineral scent that mixes with dust and warm air. Standing there beside the trench, I could feel the quiet satisfaction that comes from watching a design leave paper and become part of the land itself. The foundation filled gradually until the reinforcement grid disappeared beneath the surface and the structure began to take shape. Mike moved along the line checking measurements while I adjusted the alignment markers to keep the wall centered between the ridges. By early afternoon, the base layer had cured enough to begin stacking the first rows of reinforced block above it. Each block locked into the next with precise spacing while steel rods extended vertically through the cores to tie the structure together. Anyone driving toward the ranch entrance at that moment could already see the outline forming where the old gate once stood. Instead of two cedar posts and a chain, there was now the beginning of a solid barrier rising slowly from the limestone soil. Late in the afternoon, a familiar vehicle appeared near the brush gap again. The white Range Rover rolled forward and stopped several yards from the construction line. Brenda Whitmore stepped out and stood beside the driver door with her sunglasses reflecting the bright Texas sunlight. She looked at the trench, the concrete foundation, and the growing wall between the ridges. For a moment, she said nothing. The workers continued stacking blocks while the sound of trowels and tools echoed lightly through the air. Eventually, she called out across the entrance asking what exactly we were building. I walked over and explained in a calm voice that the structure marked the boundary of private property and that the ranch road would no longer function as a through route for subdivision traffic. She listened with a tight smile that suggested she was measuring the situation in her mind. Then she nodded slowly, returned to the Range Rover, and drove back toward Willowbrook Estates without another word. The dust settled behind her tires while the construction continued. By sunset, the reinforced base wall stretched from one limestone ridge to the other, anchored firmly into the ground beneath the ranch entrance. It was only the beginning of the structure, but the message was already clear. The Carter Ranch boundary was no longer marked by a suggestion. It was being built into the land itself. By the third morning, the structure had begun to change the entire look of the ranch entrance. The foundation that we poured earlier in the week had cured into a solid base stretching from one limestone ridge to the other, and the reinforced block wall had already climbed to chest height across the corridor. In the quiet light before sunrise, the unfinished concrete carried a pale gray color that almost matched the natural limestone scattered across the hills. Standing there with a cup of coffee in my hand, I could already see how the final structure would blend into the terrain once the top layers were completed. Mike and the crew arrived just after 7 with another load of block and reinforcement rods. The sound of their truck rolling over the gravel road echoed softly across the pasture, while a thin breeze pushed through the cedar trees behind the barn. Work resumed with the steady rhythm that construction projects tend to develop once the design is set. Mortar spread across each row, blocks lowered into place, steel rods tied into the vertical cores that would lock the entire wall together. By mid-morning, the structure had reached nearly 6 feet high, and the entrance corridor looked less like a road and more like a narrow canyon sealed by a solid barrier. Traffic from Willowbrook Estates slowed almost immediately when drivers saw the wall rising across the entrance. Some vehicles stopped briefly at the brush gap before turning around. Others crept forward just far enough to confirm that the route they had been using for weeks was no longer open. Around 10:30, a familiar engine sound appeared again near the subdivision edge. The white Range Rover rolled slowly toward the construction line and came to a stop several yards away from the wall. Brenda Whitmore stepped out and walked forward across the dusty grass until she stood facing the structure. She removed her sunglasses and studied the concrete blocks rising between the ridges as if she were trying to calculate how far the project would go. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The workers continued their tasks quietly behind me, while the breeze carried the dry scent of cedar across the entrance. Finally, she asked whether I intended to close the road permanently. Her tone remained polite, but the question carried a sharp edge of disbelief, as though she had expected the work to stop after the foundation stage. I explained calmly that the road had always been private, and that the structure simply reinforced the boundary that had existed since the property was purchased decades earlier. She responded by mentioning the inconvenience the change would cause for residents of Willowbrook Estates who had grown accustomed to using the route. I listened carefully while she spoke, then reminded her that convenience does not create legal access across someone else's land. The conversation ended with a brief silence that seemed to stretch across the entire entrance corridor. Brenda looked once more at the rising wall, and then back toward the subdivision road beyond the brush gap. Eventually, she returned to her vehicle and drove away again without another comment. Construction continued through the afternoon. By the time the sun dropped toward the western ridge, the final layer of reinforced block had been set, and the upper surface of the wall had been sealed with a smooth concrete cap. The barrier now stood nearly 8 feet tall and extended firmly from one limestone ridge to the other, anchored deep into the foundation we had poured days earlier. Anyone approaching the ranch entrance could see immediately that the corridor had been transformed into a solid boundary rather than an open road. I walked the length of the wall slowly while the crew packed their equipment and prepared to leave for the evening. The concrete surface felt cool beneath my hand, even though the day had been warm. For the first time since the traffic began crossing the ranch road, the entrance felt quiet again. No engines climbing the gravel path. No dust clouds drifting across the pasture from passing cars. Just the wind moving through the cedar trees and the soft hum of insects beginning to rise with the evening air. As the last truck disappeared down the road, I stepped back and looked at the finished structure stretching across the entrance. The Carter Ranch boundary had always existed on paper and in the soil beneath my boots. Now it existed in concrete as well, built directly into the land where no driver could pretend it was simply a suggestion. The first quiet morning after the wall was finished felt different from any morning since the subdivision appeared beyond the ridge. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee just before sunrise and listened for the familiar sound of engines climbing the gravel road. For weeks, that noise had become part of the daily rhythm, vehicles cutting through the ranch like a shortcut that had existed forever. But that morning the pasture remained still. The only sounds drifting across the 40 acres were wind brushing through cedar branches and the distant call of a hawk circling above the limestone hills. When the sun finally lifted over the ridge, it illuminated the new structure standing firmly across the entrance corridor. The reinforced wall stretched from one limestone ridge to the other exactly as planned, its surface already beginning to blend with the natural stone colors of the surrounding terrain. From a distance, it looked less like a construction project and more like a permanent feature of the landscape, something that had always belonged there. Around 8 o'clock, the first vehicle from Willowbrook Estates approached the brush gap where drivers had been cutting across for weeks. I watched from the porch as a small sedan slowed at the edge of the grass path. The driver rolled forward a few feet, saw the wall standing across the ranch entrance, and then paused long enough to understand the situation. After a moment, the car turned carefully around and drove back toward the subdivision road without attempting to cross the property. 10 minutes later, another vehicle arrived and repeated the exact same routine. By mid-morning, several drivers had approached the gap, stopped, and quietly reversed course once they realized the shortcut had disappeared. None of them attempted to drive closer to the entrance itself. The wall made the message unmistakably clear long before anyone reached the gate. Late in the afternoon, the familiar white Range Rover appeared again at the edge of the brush line. Brenda Whitmore stepped out and walked a short distance toward the ranch entrance where the wall rose between the limestone ridges. She stood there for nearly a full minute studying the structure in silence. From where I stood near the barn, I could see her expression clearly. It was not anger. It looked more like the moment someone realizes that a strategy has reached its final limit. Eventually, she turned back toward the vehicle and drove away without attempting to approach the entrance any further. That was the last time I saw the Range Rover near the ranch road. Over the next several days, the traffic through the brush gap disappeared completely. Without an open entrance, the narrow path across the grass slowly began to fade under wind and dust until it blended back into the natural pasture. The cameras on the barn roof continued recording for another week, just to confirm what the quiet mornings already suggested. Not a single vehicle attempted to cross the Carter Ranch again. One evening, I walked down to the entrance while the sky turned gold over the hill country. The reinforced wall stood solid and still in the warm light, its concrete surface casting a long shadow across the gravel road that once carried a steady line of shortcut traffic. I rested my hand against the smooth capstone along the top edge and felt the cool surface beneath my fingers. The structure had not been built to punish anyone or start a fight with the neighborhood beyond the ridge. It had been built for a much simpler reason. A boundary only works when it is strong enough to remove confusion. As the sun dropped behind the cedar trees, the ranch road behind the wall returned to the quiet purpose it had always served. It led only to the house on the hill and the barn beyond the pasture, exactly the way my father intended when he first planted those cedar gateposts decades earlier. And standing there in the evening wind, I realized something that engineers learn early in their careers. Sometimes the most effective solution is not the loudest one. Sometimes the best answer is simply building something that leaves no room for misunderstanding about where the line truly stands. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet routine that felt almost identical to the years before Willowbrook Estates appeared beyond the ridge. Each morning the ranch woke the same way it always had. Wind moved slowly through the cedar trees. The sun climbed over the limestone hills and stretched long shadows across the pasture. The gravel road that once carried a line of commuter traffic now sat empty, except for the occasional ranch truck heading toward the barn. Without the shortcut, the land returned to the calm rhythm it had held for decades. The narrow path through the brush where drivers had been cutting across the grass slowly disappeared under dust and new growth. By the end of the second week, it was difficult to see exactly where the tires had once carved their way through the pasture. The reinforced wall at the entrance stood quietly between the limestone ridges, its surface gradually taking on the same pale color as the natural stone scattered across the hills. From a distance, it looked less like a barrier and more like a natural extension of the terrain, something that belonged to the land rather than something recently built. I kept the cameras running for a while out of habit. Old engineering instincts die slowly. But the recordings showed nothing more than the occasional deer wandering across the entrance corridor at night, or a pair of wild turkeys stepping cautiously along the edge of the gravel road at sunrise. The vehicles from Willowbrook Estates never returned. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after construction finished, I drove toward town for supplies and passed the entrance to the subdivision on my way to the highway. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had before. Perfect lawns, sprinklers clicking quietly across the grass, children riding bicycles along the sidewalks near the community mailbox. But one small detail had changed near the entrance sign. The Homeowners Association announcement board now displayed a new notice reminding residents to use the official neighborhood exit when traveling to County Road 12. The message was printed neatly beneath the Willowbrook logo, as if the alternate route had never existed in the first place. I did not see Brenda Whitmore that afternoon, but I had a feeling she had already explained the situation to the residents in her own careful way. Developments like Willowbrook run on convenience and order. Once the shortcut disappeared, the neighborhood simply adjusted its routine and moved on. Back at the ranch, the days continued to pass quietly. Sometimes I walked down to the entrance in the evening just as the sky turned orange above the cedar ridge. The wall stood exactly where the survey line had marked the boundary weeks earlier. I would rest a hand against the smooth concrete capstone and look down the gravel road stretching across the pasture toward the house on the hill. That road had always been meant for one purpose only: to reach the Carter Ranch and nothing else. The structure at the entrance did not shout or demand attention. It simply existed, solid and clear, doing the quiet work that boundaries are supposed to do. One evening while standing there, I remembered something my father used to say whenever he repaired a fence along the pasture line. He believed that good land stewardship was not about fighting with neighbors or proving a point. It was about protecting what had been entrusted to you so the land would still be standing long after you were gone. The reinforced wall did exactly that. It preserved the quiet character of the ranch without arguments, without endless meetings, and without waiting for someone else to solve the problem. As the last light faded over the hill country that evening, the pasture grew still again, and the wind carried the familiar smell of cedar through the air. Looking at the entrance one final time before heading back toward the house, I realized something simple that every engineer eventually understands. A well-built structure does not need to argue with anyone. It just stands exactly where it belongs and lets the rest of the world adjust around it.